So back to this whole concept of how conservatives and by the way, is even the reasonable question. I mean, is it possible that at the core of all this thing is some kind of fundamental psychopathology that's held by somebody over at Fox News, presumably Roger Ailes, but who knows? Rupert Murdoch, Bill Salmon, I don't know. But the people who are basically programming that channel, constantly looking for stories that make black people look bad, that make Christians look persecuted, that make gay people look bad. Yeah, you get it. Everything that they're and now highlighting all these critics of Obama's Iran deal without really getting into a good, honest conversation about the details of it. Which leads us to the presidential candidates. Rand Paul has flipped enough times on enough issues that I think it's probably safe to say that he's not so much delusional as he is hopeful. All right, Rand Paul will say whatever it takes to get him elected. He's figured out that there's kind of a Republican fringe out there, particularly among young people, not even Republican, libertarian fringe out there, that will follow him the way they followed his dad. And he's trying to expand that marketplace to a larger part of the Republican Party, except that, increasingly the Republican Party is being taken over by the Tea Party, and the Tea Party, of course, funded by Americans for Prosperity and the Koch brothers, and they, of course, being libertarians. So this libertarian worldview keeps creeping in, which suggests that, the essence of the libertarian worldview is that the only reason to have government is for the defense of the country and to stop bad guys, basically army and police. And that everything else should be provided by some rich guy or some big corporation. Everything else in the world, everything else in our lives, everything else even the government does should be done for a buck rather than for the public square, for the public good. And this relatively subtle and yet at the same time fairly clear difference between what should be private, what's the appropriate revenue venue of private industry, and what should be public? What are the things that we really don't want somebody doing on a let's make a buck basis? And therefore it should be done by government. The separation of these two, there's a fairly large amount of common sense involved with it, but not among libertarians. And so we see, time after time after time, these so-called libertarian experiments, states that want to, they tried to do this in Tennessee, and the Koch brothers wouldn't even let them do that. Americans for Prosperity came in with a big advertising campaign and shut down the thing, but they were going to expand TennCare, Tennessee's Medicaid program. And they figured out a way, the Republican governor, the Republican legislature figured out a way to do this that was, quote, libertarian. In other words, they were taking the federal money, but they were running it through for-profit corporations who would skim 10, 20, 30% off the top and kick some of that back to the Republican politicians in the form of campaign contributions. And even that wasn't good enough for Americans for Prosperity / the Koch brothers. So here we have this situation where, the title of Sophia McLennan's article, Ted Cruz isn't an idiot, he's delusional, and that's far more dangerous. That's dangerous. But the bigger question, the people who are funding not just the Republican Party, but this ground operation across the United States, Americans for Prosperity, that may even be at least as good as or and effective as, perhaps better than the Republican Party at turning out the vote and all that kind of thing. That these folks, that would be the Koch brothers, may be delusional themselves. They may live in a bubble where they believe their own personal belief and philosophy, and they look at what Sam Brownback did and say, well, it's a fluke. Just keep doing it. And nobody has, apparently nobody's ever sat down with Charles and David and said, There has never been a successful libertarian country in the history of the world. Unless your definition of success is that it's a country that only works for rich people. Now, they're the second richest family in America, so it may well be that the second half of that statement is just fine with them. So what do they, but then you've got, as I said, you got rich people, you've got the shills for the rich people, and then you've got the suckers. How do you deal with the suckers? I mean, Sam Brownback cutting the Koch brothers' taxes massively, cutting billions out of his state's budget and throwing the state 2 credit downgrades. They're having to kick kids out of school because they can't afford to educate their children. I'm not talking about even higher education, which has been cut as well. So what do? Well, in Kansas, they just passed a bill on Friday that says that Kansas welfare recipients cannot get more than $25 a day in benefits. So if you want to pay your rent and your rent's $200, every day for 8 days you have to go to the ATM and get your $25 out. And by the way, every time you do that, you get charged 85 cents because they run all this stuff through, one of the big banks. You get these bank cards. But on top of that, you can't use your money for a cruise ship. Yeah, let's talk about that. That's really going to distract people.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-536-2370.
From the horror freak show disastrous experiment that Sam Brownback did in Kochistan, in Kansas.